The grizzly stood 30 yards from the camp perimeter, its breath visible in the cold mountain air. Thomas Garrett watched from behind a tree, his rifle loaded but lowered because he knew the gun wouldn't matter. Between him and the bear lay a ring of iron teeth half buried in the snow, a trap so large and complex that every man in the hunting party had called it a waste of time and metal. In less than 2 minutes, that trap would either prove Thomas right or get them all killed. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The breaking point came on March 14, 1839, 4 minutes after dawn, in a high valley of the Wind River Range. Thomas Garrett had been awake for less than a minute when he heard David Morse scream. The sound cut through the morning cold with a clarity that would stay with Thomas for the rest of his life. He emerged from his bedroll to see a grizzly bear standing over David's collapsed tent, 20 feet from where Thomas had been sleeping. The bear was massive, probably weighing 700 pounds, with fur that looked almost black in the early light. David's scream ended abruptly. The other men in the hunting party were scrambling for rifles, shouting, trying to orient themselves to a threat that had appeared without warning. Samuel Fletcher, the party's cook, had been tending the morning fire. He tried to run. The bear caught him in 3 strides. Thomas got his rifle up and fired. The shot hit the bear's shoulder. The animal turned toward him, roared, and charged. Thomas dropped the rifle and ran, knowing he couldn't reload in time. Behind him, he heard 2 more shots from other hunters. The bear changed direction, either wounded or confused by the noise. Jacob Thorne, the party's leader, fired twice at close range. Both shots hit, but the bear didn't fall. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the grizzly retreated into the pine forest, leaving blood trail and destruction behind. The entire attack had lasted 4 minutes. 2 men were dead. David Morse had been killed almost instantly. Samuel Fletcher died while the men tried to stop his bleeding, his injuries too severe to survive. 3 other hunters had minor injuries from scrambling over rocks in panic. The camp was destroyed, tents were shredded, food supplies were scattered and trampled. Thomas helped bury David and Samuel on a hillside above the camp. They used rocks to mark the graves because the ground was still partially frozen. After the burial, Jacob announced he was ending the expedition. 3 of the remaining 6 men agreed immediately. They would pack what they could carry and head back to Fort Bridger. 2 others decided to continue south toward the Green River. Thomas told Jacob he was staying. Jacob tried to talk him out of it. Hunting alone in grizzly country after what had just happened was close to suicide. Thomas knew Jacob was right, but he couldn't leave yet. Something about the attack had lodged in his mind and wouldn't let go. He had been hunting for 9 years. He had seen bears before, had even killed 2 grizzlies, but he had never seen one move through armed men as if they posed no threat. The rifles had wounded the bear but hadn't stopped it. Thomas spent that afternoon examining the camp, studying where the bear had entered, how it had moved. He found tracks leading from a game trail 60 yards uphill. The bear had approached from upwind, meaning it had scented the camp deliberately. Most hunters accepted bear danger as reality. You took precautions, stayed alert, and hoped luck stayed on your side. But watching David die, watching Samuel bleed out, watching armed men scatter from a single animal, Thomas felt something shift. There had to be a better way. He set up a new camp that evening and pulled out his leather journal. On a blank page, he started writing questions. How do you stop a bear before it reaches camp? What would a trap need to look like to hold an animal this strong? He didn't have answers yet, but he was going to find them. Thomas spent the next 3 weeks alone in the mountains, and he spent most of that time studying traps. He had been trapping beaver and smaller game for 9 years, so he understood the basic mechanics. A spring mechanism stored energy. A trigger released that energy when disturbed. Jaws snapped shut around whatever had triggered them. The principle was simple and effective for animals up to about 50 pounds. For bears, trappers used scaled-up versions of the same design. Larger springs, heavier jaws, stronger chains. Thomas examined every trap he owned and every trap he found at abandoned campsites in the region. The problems became obvious quickly. Standard bear traps were designed to catch a bear's paw. The jaws closed around the leg, ideally breaking bone and preventing escape. But the traps had to be placed along travel routes, where bears walked naturally. This meant putting them on game trails, near water sources, or around berry patches. You couldn't use them to defend a fixed position, like a camp. The bear had to come to the trap. The trap couldn't come to the bear. This was the first fundamental problem Thomas identified. Defensive traps needed to work differently than hunting traps. The second problem was strength. Even when a bear stepped directly on a trap and the jaws closed properly, grizzlies were powerful enough to break free. Thomas had heard stories from other trappers. A bear caught in a standard trap would fight violently. Sometimes the trap broke, sometimes the bear's leg broke, but the animal escaped anyway, dragging the trap until it worked free. Sometimes the chain snapped. A trap that only worked half the time wasn't reliable enough for camp defense, where failure meant death. The third problem was triggering. Standard traps used a pan trigger. The bear had to step on a flat plate with enough weight to release the spring. Grizzlies were intelligent. Old bears learned to recognize trap pans and avoid them. Even young bears could sometimes step around triggers if they were visible or if the ground had been disturbed during trap placement. Thomas needed a trigger system that worked, even if the bear was cautious. Thomas visited 2 other trapping camps in late March. He talked to men who had survived bear encounters and listened to their descriptions. One trapper named William Cross had been in his cabin when a bear tried to break through the door. The door had held only because William had reinforced it with iron straps. Another trapper, a French-Canadian named Laurent Benoit, had lost his winter food supply when a bear tore through the wall of his cache. Laurent had shot the bear afterward, but the damage was done. Every conversation confirmed what Thomas already knew. Current methods didn't work. Rifles required hitting vital areas on an animal built to absorb damage. Cabins could be reinforced, but that didn't help hunters working away from structures. Traps worked sometimes, but failed too often. The wilderness community had accepted these limitations. Thomas refused to accept them. By early April, he had filled 20 pages in his journal with observations, sketches, and questions. He needed help. He needed someone who understood metal and mechanics better than any trapper did. He needed a blacksmith. Thomas reached Fort Laramie on May 2, 1839, after 12 days of travel from the Wind River Range. The fort was a trading post and military outpost on the North Platte River, one of the few places in the region where skilled craftsmen could be found. Thomas had been there twice before to sell furs. This time he came looking for iron and expertise. He found both in a blacksmith shop attached to the fort's main compound. Heinrich Vogel was a German immigrant who had arrived in America 6 years earlier. He had worked in industrial forges in Pennsylvania before moving west to Fort Laramie, where the Army paid him to maintain weapons, repair equipment, and manufacture hardware that couldn't be shipped from the east. His shop was well equipped by frontier standards. He had a proper forge, multiple anvils, hammers in various sizes, and metalworking tools that most blacksmiths in the region didn't own. Thomas introduced himself and explained what he needed. Heinrich listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished describing the bear attack and his ideas for a defensive trap, Heinrich asked to see the sketches. Thomas spread his journal pages across the workbench. The drawings showed circular trap designs, various jaw configurations, and spring mechanisms that differed from standard construction. Heinrich studied them for several minutes. Then he looked up and asked a single question. How much money did Thomas have? Thomas had saved most of his earnings from the previous 2 trapping seasons. He had planned to use the money to expand his trap lines and purchase better equipment. Now he was willing to invest it in an experiment. He told Heinrich he could pay for materials and labor. Heinrich named a price for building 3 prototype traps according to Thomas's specifications. The cost was substantial. Thomas agreed immediately. They spent the first week discussing design problems. The circular configuration Thomas had sketched was interesting but mechanically complex. A circle distributed force evenly, which was good, but it required a spring mechanism strong enough to close jaws around a 5-foot diameter. Heinrich calculated the spring tension needed. It was far beyond what standard trap springs provided. They would need to forge custom springs from high-carbon steel, heat-treated properly to store maximum energy without breaking. The jaw teeth presented another challenge. Thomas wanted them angled inward to prevent a caught animal from pulling backward out of the trap. Heinrich explained that angled teeth would need reinforcement at the base, or they would bend under load. They experimented with different tooth profiles, forging test pieces and hammering them against the anvil to simulate impact. The design that worked best used teeth 8 inches long, 3/4 of an inch thick at the base, tapering to sharp points with a slight curve that directed force downward into the trap frame, rather than sideways where bending could occur. The trigger mechanism went through 4 iterations. The first design was too sensitive and would trigger from wind or small animals. The second was too stiff and required too much pressure. The third worked but was vulnerable to moisture, freezing the mechanism. The fourth design used a covered trigger pan with leather waterproofing and a tension adjustment that allowed fine-tuning in the field. By the end of week 3, Heinrich had completed the first trap. The first trap weighed 180 pounds. Thomas could barely lift it alone. Heinrich had used iron throughout, forged from salvaged wagon parts and broken equipment. The frame was a perfect circle 5 feet in diameter with 24 teeth spaced evenly around the inner circumference. The spring mechanism sat beneath the circular pan, compressed and locked in place by a simple trigger bar. When weight pressed down on the pan, the bar released and the jaws snapped shut with enough force to bend a shovel handle in half during their first test. Thomas paid Heinrich for all 3 traps in early June and arranged to have them transported back to the mountains by pack mule. The journey took 8 days. Other trappers he encountered along the way saw the traps and asked questions. Most reactions ranged from skepticism to outright mockery. The traps were too heavy. They were too complicated. They cost too much. One trapper named George Henderson told Thomas he had wasted his money on fancy metal that would never work better than a good rifle. Thomas didn't argue. He just kept moving. He returned to the Wind River Range in mid-June and selected a testing site near his camp. For the first month, he tested the traps on inanimate objects. He set them and triggered them with logs of various weights. The mechanism worked consistently. The jaws closed with impressive force. But Thomas noticed the first problem immediately. The teeth bent when they hit heavy logs at certain angles. Not severely, but enough to concern him. He spent 3 days straightening bent teeth using a hand hammer and a makeshift anvil. He realized the teeth needed better heat treatment or thicker bases. The second problem emerged during wet weather. In late June, a week of rain turned the testing area muddy. The trigger mechanism became sluggish. Mud worked into the spring housing and created friction that prevented proper release. Thomas disassembled one trap completely, cleaned it, and tried coating the moving parts with bear grease. This helped but didn't solve the problem entirely. He eventually created leather covers for the trigger assembly, treated with pine pitch for waterproofing. The covers kept most moisture out without interfering with trigger sensitivity. By July, Thomas felt ready to test the traps on actual animals. He set one trap near a game trail and baited the area with an elk carcass. Smaller animals triggered it twice over the next week. A coyote and a wolf. Both were caught, but both were also killed by the force of the jaws, which wasn't the goal. Thomas needed the trap to hold without necessarily killing, because a dead animal couldn't demonstrate whether the trap could restrain something still fighting. He adjusted the spring tension slightly, reducing the closing speed, but maintaining enough force to prevent escape. In early August, a young black bear found the bait. The trap caught it cleanly. The bear fought for nearly 5 minutes, trying to pull free, but the trap held without the teeth bending or the mechanism failing. Thomas watched from cover, then approached carefully and dispatched the bear with a single rifle shot. The trap had worked. But Thomas knew a young black bear weighing perhaps 200 pounds was very different from a 700-pound grizzly. Winter came early in 1839. By November, snow had closed the high passes, and Thomas cached his 3 traps in a protected ravine wrapped in oiled canvas to prevent rust. He spent the winter months at Fort Laramie, doing odd jobs and planning for spring. He talked to Heinrich Vogel several times about modifications. The teeth needed thicker bases. The trigger covers needed better sealing. Heinrich agreed to make the improvements if Thomas brought the traps back in spring. April 1840 brought the thaw. Thomas retrieved his traps and returned to Fort Laramie. Heinrich made the modifications in 2 weeks. The improved teeth were noticeably stronger. The trigger housings were now fully enclosed with hinged metal covers that could be opened for maintenance but kept moisture out during use. Thomas paid for the work and prepared to return to the mountains. Before he left, he heard that Jacob Thorne was organizing a new hunting expedition. Thomas found Jacob at the fort's trading post. Jacob remembered him. They talked about the previous year's attack. Jacob asked what Thomas had been doing since. Thomas explained about the traps. Jacob was interested but skeptical. He said Thomas could join his expedition if he wanted. The party would head into the Absaroka Range for a 3-month hunt starting in early May. 8 men total, experienced hunters, planning to work beaver streams and elk meadows. Thomas agreed immediately. The hunting party assembled on May 7th. Besides Thomas and Jacob, there were 6 others. Martin Cole and James Peterson were brothers from Ohio who had been trapping for 4 years. Robert Hawkins was a former Army scout. Daniel Freeman was young, only 22, on his 2nd season. Antoine Mercier was a French-Canadian voyageur with extensive wilderness experience. Edward Walsh rounded out the group, a quiet man who kept to himself but was known as an excellent shot. When the men saw Thomas's traps, the reactions were predictable. Martin Cole laughed and asked if Thomas planned to catch the whole mountain. James Peterson lifted one trap a few inches and asked how Thomas expected to carry 3 of them, plus his regular gear. Robert Hawkins examined the mechanism and admitted the engineering was impressive, but questioned whether it was practical. Only Jacob and Antoine seemed genuinely interested. Antoine had survived a grizzly attack 3 years earlier and carried scars across his chest as proof. The party traveled northwest from Fort Laramie into the Absaroka Range. The journey took 9 days. They established a base camp near a creek system that showed signs of active beaver colonies. The location was good for hunting and trapping. Plenty of game, fresh water, timber for firewood, and defensible terrain. Thomas immediately began setting his traps each evening in a loose perimeter around camp, roughly 30 yards out from the tents. The other men watched but didn't help. The routine became established quickly. Each morning, Thomas checked and reset his traps. Each evening, he positioned them again after the camp was set up. The process took about 40 minutes. The other hunters began calling them Garrett's Folly. Thomas ignored the jokes. He checked trigger sensitivity daily, cleared debris from the mechanisms, and maintained the positions. He knew the test would come eventually. The test came on May 23, 1840, at approximately 2 hours past midnight. Thomas woke to a sound he had learned to recognize, something large moving through brush with deliberate caution. He lay still in his bedroll, listening. The camp was quiet except for snoring from one of the tents. The fire had burned down to coals. Thomas reached slowly for his rifle and sat up without making noise. 30 yards out, beyond the firelight, he could hear branches breaking. Whatever was approaching was moving around the camp perimeter, testing. Thomas stood and moved to where Jacob Thorne slept. He touched Jacob's shoulder. Jacob woke instantly, a survival instinct from years in the wilderness. Thomas whispered 2 words, "Bear coming." Jacob nodded and began waking the other men quietly. Within 2 minutes, all 8 hunters were awake, armed, and watching the darkness beyond their camp. The grizzly appeared at the edge of the firelight. It was a large male, probably weighing 600 pounds, with distinctive silver-tipped fur along its shoulders. The bear stopped and stood upright, sniffing the air. It had clearly scented the camp and was investigating. Thomas counted seconds. The bear dropped to all 4s and moved closer, following what Thomas recognized as a game trail that led directly toward the tents. The trail passed through the trap perimeter. Thomas whispered instructions. No one shoots unless the trap fails. The men held position, rifles ready, but lowered. The bear moved with surprising quiet for an animal its size. It paused twice, scenting, then continued forward. At 40 yards, it stopped again. Thomas could see its head turning, examining the camp layout. Then it started moving again, directly along the trail. Thomas watched the bear's path and calculated. 3 more steps, 2 more steps. The bear's front left paw came down on the trigger pan. The sound was like a branch snapping. The spring released. The jaws closed with enough force that Thomas heard the impact from 30 yards away. The bear roared and lunged backward. The trap held. The teeth had penetrated through fur and into the leg. The bear pulled against the trap's weight, dragging it several feet, but the trap was too heavy to pull far, and the teeth angled inward prevented the leg from sliding free. The grizzly fought the trap for approximately 30 seconds, pulling, twisting, biting at the metal. Then Jacob gave a quiet order. 3 men fired simultaneously. All 3 shots hit. The bear collapsed and was still. The camp remained silent for several seconds. Then Robert Hawkins said something unprintable and laughed. Martin Cole walked out to examine the trap, forgetting to be cautious. Antoine Mercier just nodded at Thomas with what might have been respect. Jacob Thorne approached the dead bear and studied how the trap had held it. He looked at Thomas and asked how much it would cost to have Heinrich Vogel build another one. Thomas told him $30. Jacob said he would pay $40 if Thomas could get one made within a month. By morning, 3 other men in the party had made similar requests. Thomas returned to Fort Laramie in late June 1840 with orders for 7 traps and a list of modifications based on field performance. Heinrich Vogel was in his shop repairing a broken wagon axle when Thomas arrived. Heinrich set down his hammer and listened as Thomas described the successful bear encounter. Then Thomas explained what needed improvement. The teeth had penetrated well, but 2 had bent slightly under the strain of the bear's thrashing. The trigger mechanism had worked perfectly, but needed faster reset capability for camps that moved frequently. The overall weight made transport difficult over rough terrain. Heinrich examined Thomas's notes and sketches. He proposed several solutions. For the teeth, he would use a harder steel alloy and add reinforcement ribs along the back of each tooth. This would increase strength without significantly increasing weight. For the trigger mechanism, he designed a simplified reset system using a single lever instead of the multi-step process Thomas's current traps required. For the weight problem, Heinrich suggested hollowing out sections of the circular frame that didn't bear primary load. This could reduce weight by 20 to 30 pounds without compromising structural integrity. They spent 2 weeks experimenting. Heinrich forged test teeth using different steel compositions and heat treatments. He bent them deliberately to find the failure point. The improved design withstood far more force before bending. Thomas tested the new trigger reset mechanism repeatedly. He could now reset a trap in under 3 minutes compared to the previous 7-minute process. The weight reduction worked as Heinrich predicted. The improved trap weighed 152 pounds, noticeably lighter but still substantial. Production began in July. Heinrich hired an apprentice to help with the increased workload. They established an assembly process. Heinrich forged the major components while the apprentice handled finishing work and assembly. Each trap took approximately 6 days to complete, from raw materials to finished product. By September, Heinrich had completed 9 traps. Thomas delivered 7 to the hunters who had ordered them and kept 2 improved versions for himself. Word continued spreading through the trapping community during the fall and winter of 1840. Thomas encountered other hunters at Fort Laramie and at various camps throughout the region. Many had heard about the trap that stopped a grizzly. Some remained skeptical. Others wanted to see the traps in person. Thomas showed them willingly and explained the design principles. Several trappers asked if they could copy the design and have local blacksmiths build versions. Thomas agreed without hesitation. He had never intended to keep the design secret or control its production. By spring 1841, 3 other blacksmiths in the region were building variations of Thomas's trap design. A blacksmith at Fort Bridger named Samuel York produced a slightly smaller version that weighed 120 pounds. A traveling blacksmith named Patrick O'Brien built traps with straight teeth instead of curved, which worked adequately, though not as well as Heinrich's curved design. The variations bothered Thomas less than he expected. The core principle was spreading. Hunters were protecting their camps with defensive perimeters instead of relying solely on rifles and luck. That was what mattered. Thomas had never wanted profit or recognition. He had wanted to solve a problem that killed people. The solution was now available to anyone who needed it. October 18, 1841, found Thomas with a hunting party of 14 men camped in a valley on the western slope of the Teton Range. The party was larger than usual, assembled by a trader named Marcus Webb, who planned an ambitious 6-month expedition. Thomas had joined as a guide and brought 4 of his traps. The camp was well organized, with tents arranged in a rough semicircle and Thomas's traps positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. The location offered good hunting, but several men had reported seeing bear sign in the area. Fresh tracks, scat, and claw marks on trees indicated at least one large grizzly was active nearby. The attack came at dusk on the third day. A female grizzly with 2 cubs appeared on the hillside above camp. The sow was defensive, reacting to the perceived threat the camp posed to her cubs. She charged without warning. Thomas saw her coming and shouted. The men grabbed rifles, but there was no time to form a proper defense. The bear covered the distance impossibly fast. Her front leg hit the first trap at full speed. The jaws closed. The bear's momentum carried her forward, dragging the trap 6 feet before it slowed her. She roared and tried to change direction. Her left rear leg came down on the second trap. The impact threw her sideways. She was now caught by 2 legs, but her size and strength allowed her to continue moving. Men were firing now, but the light was fading, and the chaos made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The sow reached the edge of camp, pulling both traps. She swung at the nearest tent with her free front paw, collapsing it. Daniel Freeman, who had been inside, scrambled out the back and rolled clear. The bear lunged toward him. Her right front paw landed on the third trap, positioned exactly where Thomas had predicted an attacking animal would step. The jaws closed. The sow was now held by 3 legs. The combined weight of 450 pounds of iron stopped her forward progress. She thrashed violently, trying to free herself. Jacob Thorne and Robert Hawkins approached from the sides, rifles ready. They fired simultaneously at close range. Both shots hit vital areas. The bear fell. The entire encounter from first appearance to final shot had lasted less than 3 minutes. The camp was silent except for heavy breathing and the sound of someone checking Daniel Freeman for injuries. He was shaken but unharmed. 2 other men had minor injuries. One had fallen running from his tent and bruised his ribs. Another had cut his hand on a knife while scrambling for weapons. Marcus Webb walked slowly around the dead bear, examining how the 3 traps had worked together to stop her charge. He looked at Thomas and said something that would be repeated throughout the region over the following months. Without those traps, she would have reached the tents with people still inside. Thomas didn't respond. He was already checking the trap mechanisms for damage, planning repairs, thinking about placement adjustments for tomorrow's camp. The innovation had worked exactly as intended. The story of the Teton encounter spread rapidly through the frontier trapping network during the winter of 1841. Marcus Webb told the story at Fort Bridger, Fort Laramie, and every trading post between. Other men from the party confirmed the details. A charging grizzly with cubs, the most dangerous situation a hunter could face, had been stopped by strategic trap placement before reaching the camp proper. 2 men might have died without those traps. The story changed calculations for hunting parties operating in bear country. By spring 1842, Heinrich Vogel was producing 12 traps per month and still couldn't keep up with orders. The price had stabilized at $30 per trap, expensive but increasingly viewed as essential equipment rather than optional luxury. Blacksmiths at Fort Bridger, Bent's Fort, and Fort Hall were also producing their own versions. The designs varied in details but followed the same core principles Thomas had established. Circular frames, inward angled teeth, spring mechanisms capable of stopping large animals, and trigger systems designed for perimeter defense rather than trail hunting. The United States Army took notice in 1843. A captain named James Morrison visited Fort Laramie and examined Heinrich's traps. Morrison was responsible for security at several frontier outposts where bear encounters threatened soldiers and civilians. He ordered 20 traps for distribution among Wyoming and Montana territory posts. The military adoption gave the design additional legitimacy. If the Army trusted these traps for fort defense, civilian hunters felt confident using them for camp protection. Variations emerged to serve different needs. Some trappers requested smaller versions weighing around 80 pounds for use by solo hunters who couldn't transport the full-size traps. Others wanted larger versions with heavier teeth for deliberate bear hunting rather than defensive purposes. A few innovative hunters developed portable versions that could be broken down into components and reassembled on site. Each variation maintained the fundamental architecture Thomas had developed, but adapted it for specific circumstances. Trading companies began stocking the traps by 1845. The The American Fur Company included them in supply catalogs. Independent traders carried them to rendezvous gatherings where trappers purchased equipment for the coming season. The widespread availability meant that any hunter willing to invest $30 to $40 could acquire protection that had been unavailable 5 years earlier. Records from the period, fragmentary as they are, suggest a measurable decrease in fatal bear attacks among parties using perimeter trap defenses. Thomas continued hunting and guiding parties through the 1840s and into the 1850s. He never profited significantly from his invention beyond his normal guiding fees. He had shared the design freely and never attempted to patent or control production. Other men made money manufacturing and selling traps. Thomas seemed content with having solved the problem he set out to solve. By 1850, his traps or variations of them were standard equipment across the Rocky Mountain region. The concept had become infrastructure, as common and expected as rifles and knives. The trap that started as an obsessive response to tragedy had become simply how people survived in grizzly country, so routine that younger trappers didn't remember a time when defensive perimeter traps weren't available. Thomas Garrett died on November 3, 1868, in a small cabin outside Bozeman, Montana Territory. He was 54 years old. The cause was pneumonia, common enough in the region's harsh winters. He had been living alone, still guiding occasional hunting parties, but spending most of his time maintaining trap lines and teaching younger men wilderness survival techniques. A neighbor found him 2 days after his death and arranged for burial in a small cemetery on a hillside overlooking the Gallatin Valley. His personal effects were minimal. The cabin contained basic furniture, hunting equipment, and 3 leather-bound journals filled with sketches and notes about trap designs, animal behavior, and observations about wilderness survival. His sister in Ohio inherited the journals. She kept them without understanding their significance. Years later, her grandson donated them to a historical society in Montana. Researchers examining frontier life discovered the journals in 1923 and recognized their value as documentation of practical innovation on the American frontier. Thomas had never married. He had no children. The few people who knew him described him as quiet, competent, and obsessively focused on whatever problem he was trying to solve. He didn't seek attention or credit. When people asked about the trap design, he talked about Heinrich Vogel's metalworking skill more than his own ideas. When younger trappers asked for advice, he shared everything he knew without expecting payment or recognition. The closest thing to a legacy he intentionally left was the knowledge he passed to men who learned from him. But the unintentional legacy lasted far longer. Into the 1850s and 60s, trappers, hunters, prospectors, and settlers continued using variations of the defensive trap design Thomas had developed. The traps protected camps, homesteads, mining operations, and remote outposts. Exact numbers are impossible to determine, but historical accounts reference multiple instances where trap perimeters prevented bear attacks that would have resulted in deaths or serious injuries. Modern historians estimate several dozen lives were saved over the following decades because people built defenses that worked before confrontation became necessary. Museums in Montana and Wyoming display original Garrett-style traps. The Teton County Historical Society has one of Heinrich Vogel's early models still functional after more than a century and a half. The Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming, includes trap manufacturing in its exhibits about frontier technology. Academic studies of frontier innovation cite Thomas's traps as examples of practical problem-solving that emerged from necessity rather than formal education or institutional support. The phrase "built like a Garrett trap" appeared in letters and journals from the 1850s through the 1880s, meaning construction that could withstand extreme conditions. The metaphor outlasted knowledge of who Garrett was or what he had actually built. By the early 20th century, few people remembered the specific story, but the principle Thomas had proven remained valid. Intelligence and preparation could overcome raw wilderness danger. Good engineering eliminated problems before they became crises. One man's refusal to accept that people had to die from preventable causes could change how an entire region approached survival. The ring of iron teeth that stopped a charging grizzly in 1840 wasn't just a trap. It was proof that better solutions existed if someone cared enough to find them.